This. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm Albie Miles. This is Constantino Zubrin. We're thrilled to be here today to talk about some of our research on household emergency preparedness in Hawaii. Before we get into some of the key aspects of the study that we conducted, I want to provide a little bit of context justifying the study. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the biophysical context, focusing on climate destabilization, some of the social economic context, focusing on poverty and food insecurity in the state of Hawaii, and then some of the context around infrastructure and planning, with an emphasis on the Port of Honolulu being a key structural bottleneck in the import system, and then the lack of food storage and public-private coordination around disaster preparedness response. So briefly, for those who are tracking some of this literature, there is increasing calls from global scientific bodies for the transformation of agri-food systems, because they're the generator of so many social and ecological externalities. This is one example, came out in 2018, called the Inter-Academies Partnership, 130 national academies of sciences and medicine from around the world. Their bottom line summary is the food and agricultural system is driving climate destabilization and poor public health outcomes, and we need to engage in this process of transformation. And that is a key way to improve environmental quality and health. Recent IPCC reports show that we are on track not to keep within planetary boundaries in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. It will exceed the 1.5 degrees of warming by 2030, 2052. The current pledges, with the exception of the recent pledges out of COP28, have us on track to reach 3.5, as much as 3.5 degrees pre-industrial warming by 2100. And these trends in terms of climate destabilization could last for centuries to millennia. And we should expect, again, without significant mitigation, that there'll be severe economic and humanitarian crises by as early as 2040. Recent COP28, even though there are official pledges coming out of the COP28 to adhere to the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius warming relative to the pre-industrial era, of course, there's the language and then there's the actual actions that member nations take. So it's a bit of a question mark in terms of our ability to adhere to those targets. A bit of additional context is that there has been documented significant impacts on the food and agricultural system in the United States. Those impacts on both production, on infrastructure are increasing and are anticipated to continue well into the end of this century without significant mitigation measures. One of the things I think is important to place in context is that there is frequently calls to increase local agricultural production as a key way to build resilience in the agri-food system of Hawaii. And that, though that is important, that can only go so far, especially in the context of climate impacts that may visit our communities. And so in some ways, being coupled to global commodity chains is a form of resilience, because we're so highly dependent upon imported food. We cannot currently rely on our existing food supplies generated from these islands to feed ourselves, especially with approaching a 1.5 million population plus the 9+ million visitors. So this is just one example of some of the potential catastrophic impacts of severe weather events in Hawaiian Islands. Hurricane Lane in 2018. You can see the big island of Hawaii just outside of view in the upper part of this illustration. And our colleagues at the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency said if Hurricane Lane would have come within 100 miles of the Port of Honolulu, there would have been severe damage and we would have seen social outcomes similar to that of Puerto Rico. So match categories down from the structure. And so it's important, given this context, that we begin the process of actually preparing for future climate shocks. So some of you are already familiar with these kind of summary data points on the food system of Hawaii. We're geographically isolated, obviously enough. High levels of food import dependence. It's all coming through the port of Honolulu. Our economy is largely just in time, meaning things are coming into the state on a need basis. The amount of food that we store in the state is approximately 5 to 7 days, and that's literally what is either in our households or on the supermarket shelves or being unloaded from barges at the port of Honolulu. We already have high to moderate rates of household food insecurity, depending upon which data source that you look at, particularly high rates of food insecurity in low-income communities, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community. So we have a fairly large, vulnerable community in some parts of the state. All of our critical systems infrastructure, the Port of Honolulu, the refineries, energy production, et cetera, is all on the south side of this island of Oahu, and it's vulnerable to climate shocks. Importantly, there is very little coordination between private sector actors and agencies like the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency and the private sector food importers and distributors who are responsible for largely feeding the population in Hawaii. There's very little in-state food storage, very little emergency food storage. FEMA stores enough food and water for about 3 days for a population the size of this island. It does not take into account the visitor population. So we don't store a lot of emergency food. And so into this context, we began to ask the question of, because the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency in 2017 increased the number of days of recommended household storage of food, water, and essential medicine, we began to raise the question, well, how many people in the state of Hawaii actually meet that standard? And the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency did not have data, nor did they have a research agenda, nor a research budget to answer that question. So for their strategic planning purposes and preparation for some future natural disaster, we took it on, Constantino and I, to do the research to help provide them with actionable data for their emergency planning purposes. Last couple of points I'll make, and then I'll turn it over to Constantinos to take us into the study. This is just an outline of if a Category 3 hurricane or above approaches the Port of Honolulu, this island, you can see different levels of inundation. And so those lines represent 5 feet of sea level rise, 10 feet and 20 feet in the red. That's a considerable amount of the critical food import and other import infrastructure for the state, which would essentially disable our ability to import food and other consumables into the state. So important in terms of the potential impact of future hurricanes and severe storms. So very briefly, the concept of food system resilience is gaining traction in the academic community. It is essentially the capacity of the food and agricultural sector to maintain household food security in the context of various social, economic, and other disturbances. And there's different attributes of food system resilience that are increasingly surfacing. And there's this growing academic literature around food system resilience that we wanted to contribute to and bring some new understandings to state planning here in Hawaii. So one of the key aspects of food system resilience is functional redundancy in the system. And functional redundancy means that there are multiple sources of food that are available to households. And so because of our geographic isolation, because of a lack of ability to easily ship food into the state, then households become one key way that functional redundancy is secured. And so our essential research question was, well, if we have to rely in the case of a natural disaster on households to take care of themselves for some period of time before additional food supplies arrive, how many people are actually prepared at the Hawaii Emergency Management standard of a 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine. So I'm going to turn it over to Konstantinos to take us into the study and summarize some of the key findings.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you everyone for having us. As Albie, thank Albie for providing extensive context on our study and the importance of our study. Well, we all know that Hawaii is very remote, the most remote place in the world. Therefore, it makes it extremely difficult still to get here. During the event and after the event. So it's very essential to understand the interplay between the household preparedness, individual, agency, it's us, what can we do in order to prepare, rather than rely only on the government. So our study, I'll just give you a little bit of a conceptual framework of our study. That is what FEMA operates. The first stage is the mitigation stage, strengthening pretty much the community, getting all those measures in order to increase the second stage of preparedness. Preparedness in what? There are so many dimensions of preparedness that we just get to breaking them down to just three: food, water, and medicine. Then the third stage is the response stage, where pretty much it's like during the event, which we do not cover as much in the study. And then the recovery. So what we do as individuals, how well prepared we are, plays a major role on the recovery stage. How fast we're going to recover, as well as what are the next steps after the recovery, having the knowledge, having the experience in order again to go back into the mitigation stage. So the purpose of our study is pretty much to examine two key terms over here that I'm going to focus on in the next slide: perceived and actual household preparedness. The third term is household readiness. Usually, actual preparedness and readiness, they're used interchangeably. However, the way we define them is perceived is what we think, what we believe. It's our feeling of preparedness. Actual preparedness is the extent. It's like numerically, how many days go ready with essential supplies stored, like food, water, and medicine. And readiness is pretty much the locality plays a major role here. It's like based on the location, based on the state you live in. Do you meet the recommendations of the agency? That brings it like into three major research questions. If there is any variation between actual preparedness and perceived preparedness. So what we think, is this actually what we do? Do they converge or they diverge? Then what are the effects of public awareness? Do we know what to do? So as you know, to get prepared. So it's the relationship between awareness and actual preparedness. And the third, as Albie mentioned, that is at the core of this applied research, is are we ready in Hawaii? The readiness is the major role. And again, there are the operational definitions now for each of the dimensions of preparedness, if you will. Perceived preparedness, self-reported level of household preparedness measured in a Likert scale, ranging from not prepared at all to very prepared. Very simple question, to your knowledge. What is the level of preparedness as of today? And then you choose, oh, I feel like I'm prepared, or very prepared, or not prepared at all. What is now the actual preparedness? How is that measured? It's like, okay, forget about how you feel about it. For how many days you have food, water, and medicine stored? Then it's like, it becomes like from the abstract, vague indicator into more approximate. Be like, okay, I think for 3-4 days, I'll be good. And then the readiness. The number of households that they actually meet the 14 days essential supplies recommendation in all essential supplies combined. So if I'm water ready, but I don't have food, I have a problem. I'm not ready. So that was pretty much the operationalization. And now we get into more of the technical, the methodological portion of it, which is briefly I'll describe the sampling technique and then the 3-stage analysis that we conducted. Let's start with the sampling design. We use the proportional quota sampling design, where from which we generated 1,006 households sampled. And the threshold of the margin of error was minus plus 3% to the general population of households in Hawaii. We used opt-in online panels and computer-assisted telephone interviews. In order to increase the representativeness of our results, we performed, of course, a weighting method known as a random iterative method. Now, in terms of the survey design, it was organized, it was structured in 5 different sections. The first one, we focused on perceptions of risks, hazard risks, and as well as what the state should do in order to protect us. The second one was about the household's emergency preparedness overall, including pretty much all 3 dimensions that I just talked about. And the third was the emergency preparedness, awareness, and communication. Are we aware? How we are aware? How do we get the information? The fourth and the fifth were pretty much the respondents' demographics and the household demographic characteristics. And here is the first stage, preliminary stage of our analysis that really gave us the incentive to get more into it and to employ a scientific method, a more scientific method in order to understand what's going on. As you can see here, this is a simple cross. Perceived preparedness versus readiness by category. 71% of the households in our sample, they think they are water supply ready. 42% from those, only 42% they have like enough water for 7 days, while only 90% they meet the high amount recommendation for 14 days. So what we think has nothing to do with what we do. And that is like, why is that happening? Why? How is that possible? It's like to have a completely different, I would say, such a divergent interpretation of what I should do, what I do, and what I think I do. So it's like, that creates like it's a very interesting question. The same applies for the food supply. 69% of the households think they are ready, 55% enough food for 7 days, 29% for 14 days. For medical supplies, 83%, oh yeah, we're ready, 62% only for 7 days, and 39% for 14 days. So we had to move on and to see what is the distribution now by county, and I'll go a little faster. So as we see that pretty much in all counties, the households think they are ready, but they don't meet the actual, they don't meet the 14 days threshold of readiness for all essential supplies combined. And that is the striking thing, statewide. Statewide, how many households are ready? As if, you know, in a case where a natural disaster happens today, how many of the households are actually ready? 12%, only 88%. But be careful, it doesn't mean that it's like they are not ready at all, but they don't meet the 14-day recommended readiness for food, water, and medical supplies. So we got more into understanding, like inquiring, to see now if there is any statistical dependence or association between the extent of preparedness, that means the actual preparedness, the number of days that were prepared, and the perception of preparedness. And as we see here, the thing is a lot more complicated, the issue. As perceptions of preparedness increase, actual preparedness increases as well. This is where it's hidden, because it's like, okay, people are more, they think they're ready, and they're more ready than the ones that they think that they're ready. The question here is like, are they ready enough for the place where they live, based on the vulnerabilities and how susceptible they are. So as we see here, just focus on the perceived preparedness on the most prepared, things that are very confident. That's like, oh yeah, we're prepared. They have water supplies for 7 days, food supplies for 8.7 days, it's like approximately 9 days, and medical supplies for 10 days. What does that mean? That means that they all meet the FEMA's recommendation for a 7-day of essential supply storage. So then we had a discussion with Albie, and we were like, okay, do you think that awareness plays a major role? It's like, let's make a study on that. And we went pretty much on developing a generalized linear model where the dependent variable is the 3 models, 3 linear regression models, where in the first model, the dependent variable is like how many days of water supply you had stored, the second about food supply, and the third about medical supply. And this is what we found, that there is a positive relationship between actual preparedness with familiarity with FEMA and HAIMA general guidelines and public awareness of HAIMA's updated guidelines. Yep, as expected from the literature, as awareness increases, so as the actual preparedness, the extent of days having essential supplies stored. Also the attitudes of importance, that is like, okay, people, households understand how important it is to have essential supplies stored, because some, yeah, but most, the vast majority, they all understand the importance, and they have a positive relationship importance and the actual preparedness. Then the years of residence, and why we included this variable? This variable was included because more years we live in a place, more community ties we develop, and the sense of belonging. And that is pretty much an indicator that has a positive impact on water, food, and medical supplies of actual preparedness. That is like, it increases to all the first category. And then the presence of pets, where with Albie we were talking about it, it's like, how did that came? It's very interesting. And there is a link, an association between presence of pets, socioeconomic status, years of living. I mean, there is an interaction there. And people tend to get more prepared because they feel more responsible. Then water, only for water and supplies, presence of people with disability seem to be less prepared in water and food supplies. County of residence, where Hawaii County tends to be more prepared on food and water than the other count is combined. Female respondents at the individual level tend to be more prepared than men and other categories of gender. And marital status, married individuals appear to be more prepared, higher levels of preparedness, actual preparedness. And then religion, we included this as well because of the literature where Mormons appear to be a lot more prepared than the other religion categories combined. Then only for food and medical supplies, we see that the perceived risk for natural hazards increases the likelihood pretty much of having food and medical supplies stored. And then individuals that they recognize that the state should provide better services on emergency management tend to be more aware and tend to be a lot more prepared than the others. The rest is for water or food or medical supplies, that is like just one of the three. Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander appear to be more water supply prepared. Income level play a major role as well, where households with more than 40,000, they are more likely to have like a higher amount of food supply stored. Preferred mode of communication, the ones that prepare through radio to get the communication, improve public storage recommendation. Again, education, again, it has like a positive relationship, and the presence of infants, it has like a negative relationship on medical supplies. You can see the parentheses for which of the essential supply there is a relationship. And now we get into the core question, which is we employed a generalized linear model, a logic function, logic regression, which is like pretty much a logistic regression with using maximum likelihood estimation. And this is what we get. We are trying to predict the likelihood of being ready. Not if it decreases the level of preparedness, the extent of the number of days or the extent, the time extent that we have like supplies, essential supplies stored, but whether or not households meet the 14 days recommended recommendation threshold for essential supplies stored. And we see that households that they are familiar with HAIMA's and FEMA's guidelines, they're almost 4 times more likely to be prepared. Awareness plays a major role. Now, households that they're aware only about the recommendation, the 14-day recommendation, they are 82% more likely. And this is a distinction of it here. FEMA and HAIMA general guidelines is like in general about what we should do, what is the preparedness guidelines. Well, public awareness of HAIMA updated guidelines, it's like, okay, I got this information, could be from anywhere, but I know that I need to have essential supplies stored for 14 days. And moving on, importance of essential supply storage. Households that they consider, that they identify that it's very important to have essential supplies stored, they're almost 5 times more likely to be ready than the ones that do not find it as important. Also, the ones, that is a very, very interesting finding, the ones who recognize, who suggest, now the households who recognize and suggest that the state should improve emergency management services are 4 times more likely to be ready. That means that I know what I have to do. I'm aware, I see that there are deficiencies, and I recommend that we must improve it. Even though I'm prepared, but we must improve it. Then the presence of pets, 2.6 times more likely, households with pets to be ready again. 14 days of essential supplies readiness. Years of readiness, for each additional year, it's almost 2% increase on the likelihood. So if you are like for 1 year in Hawaii, it's like 2%. More likely than the others that they are less than a year. If you have for 2 years, it becomes 4%, and so on and so forth. County of residence, where Hawaii Island households in the Big Island appear to be more likely, 2.4 times more likely ready than the households in other counties combined. And then Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, they are almost five times more likely to be prepared, and females, not prepared, ready, 14 days ready. And for gender, the females tend to be like 8 times more likely to be ready than males. And those are the conclusions. I mean, my apologies for tiring you. It's like a lot of analysis, a lot of data. It's like 5 different models. I understand it's overwhelming with the numbers, but this is where we get pretty much, at the bottom. Only 12% of households in Hawaii have 14-day essential supplies stored for all essential supplies combined. Also, our analysis supports that actual preparedness significantly varies across levels of perceived preparedness. And even though there is an increase, this increase is not enough in order to be ready. Households with a perception of being very prepared tend to meet PIMA's recommendations, yet they are far from the formal HAIMA recommendations for 14 days of essential supplies storage. And then familiarity or awareness with HAIMA guidelines and recommendations increases the extent of actual preparedness as well as the likelihood of households' readiness. And finally, several socioeconomic and demographic characteristics are associated with both the extent of actual preparedness and the likelihood of readiness. And then I'll give that for Albie for the recommendations. Yes, I mean, it's like together, it's like what we recommend. We actually wrote yesterday, we finalized our report. It's the final report of findings on the applied research. Also, we developed a manuscript. This is like based on the same idea, just we expanded a lot more through the literature review, where we just submitted it for review. However, for the manuscript, it's still under review, of course, but for the report, the final report of findings, we will be happy to share upon request. And over there, you'll see like a more extensive version, of course, of the recommendations that we have. The first dimension of that we identified as being very crucial because there is also that awareness play a major role. So communications, we have to raise awareness of HAIMA emergency preparedness. How do we do that? Well, we actually have to improve the communication campaigns, the media platforms or outlets that we use. Prepositioning of emergency food in identified vulnerable communities. So to now, from this general study that pretty much we generalize the entire state, to identify specific blocks, census blocks, and to detect the vulnerabilities of the specific census blocks. Then develop a new emergency food storage infrastructure. As we found, public storage plays a major role. It's a preventive factor of readiness in most households when it comes to food. And finally, to develop formal coordination plan and strategy between public sector and private agencies. So to have like aligned services and coordinated practices in order to support any type of endeavors associated with emergency preparedness and planning. And that's it. Thank you so much for coming. I do have some